In this video, we're going to talk about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is using government spending to achieve macroeconomic objectives like growing the economy or reducing unemployment or trying to stop inflation. Now, the federal budget process begins with the president submitting a budget to Congress in the beginning of the year. Congress has the responsibility for all spending, so fiscal policy really is the responsibility of the Congress. Now, the fiscal year is not from January 1st to December 31st, but rather the federal fiscal calendar runs from October 1st, that's when it begins, to the end of September in the following year. And the federal budget, by statute, by law, is designed to achieve two things. One, to finance the activities of the federal government, like the military and different social programs and things like that. And then the second is to achieve macroeconomic objectives. The Congressional Budget Office is a nonpartisan, independent group that helps in the budgetary process. Their main goal is to provide independent analysis of the budget, and if people propose new laws, they will study them and explain what the impact to the budget will be. The Council of Economic Advisors is a group of economists that helps advise the president and the public about the state of affairs in the economy. They keep the public well informed about where the economy might be going. Now, if we look at the United States budget, and here is a pro forma budget going on to 2031, we can see a couple of things. In general, the government spends in the neighborhood of $4.5 trillion a year. If you go back a few years and you look at the spending, that's what it's been tracking to. About $4.5 trillion is spent by the federal government on all the programs. Now, you can also see that the revenues that come in are not quite that. The revenues are about $3.5 trillion. So we have this situation where we're spending $4.5 trillion, we're earning or taxing or bringing in about $3.5 trillion. So we have about $1 trillion each year more in spending than we have in revenues that are coming in. And this gap, the amount of spending and the gap, has gotten larger during the pandemic years. So this is started, it's actually gotten worse over time and not better. Another thing we can notice is that most of the revenues come from individual taxpayers. They come from either individual income taxes or payroll taxes. And so most of the money that comes in, that $3.5 trillion, comes from individual people, workers, and taxes on workers. We can also, and the amount that corporations pay is relatively small. Now, some people find that to be problematic. Other people not so much, because if corporations paid larger taxes, they'd eventually be paid by individuals in the prices of products. But it just is noteworthy when looking at this. And so we have the situation: the government is spending more than it's bringing in, and this is projected to go out throughout the next decade. We can look in kind of broad categories about where the money goes or how it's spent, and you can see that the federal government, about 25% is spent on Social Security, which is pension payments for older people over 65. Another 25% is spent on government-run healthcare, Medicare, which is healthcare for older people, and Medicaid, which is healthcare for people with lower incomes, is about another 25%. So 50% of the budget goes on retirement programs and medicine. Then we can see there's about 15% is on defense. Almost 10% is on interest. This is in a circumstance where the interest rates are low, so that's a bit concerning. And then the non-discretionary part is about 15%. So you can see the basic categories where the money goes. This is for 2019, but we can come a little closer. This is the 2021, and it's a different graph, but the categories are roughly the same. About a quarter on Social Security, about a quarter on Medicare and Medicaid, and then defense and the interest are about 15 each. Now, one of the interesting trends to note here is there's the amount of spending that is mandatory, meaning the law says we have to spend the money. Something like Social Security, if you qualify for it, then the money gets spent. That's called mandatory spending, which is different than discretionary spending, which the Congress and the executive branch, have some discretion over whether we spend it or not. The amount of mandatory spending is increased dramatically over the years. It was about 28%, and now it's in the mid 60s. So about 65% of the spending is mandatory, meaning that 35% of the spending is discretionary. So again, from a budgetary process, this is a little bit concerning because mandatory spending we don't really have as much control over. We don't have as much leeway over going forward. So the shift is being towards more mandatory spending and as a result, less discretionary spending. We can look at the 2020 budget, the pro forma budget. This was done in October of 2019, and this was in the months before the coronavirus pandemic, and you had a typical year. The government expected to bring in about $3.7 trillion, to spend about $4.7 trillion, and run a deficit of a little more than $1 trillion. And this was typical of 2020 and the few previous years, about spending about that much and having a deficit of about $1 trillion each year. But we all know what happened. The pandemic hit, the coronavirus pandemic, and there was a lot of spending that happened to try to deal with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, both from a medical standpoint and an economic standpoint. The CARES Act represented about $2.3 trillion worth of spending, and so we spent a lot more than the $4.7 trillion. As a matter of fact, we spent $6.6 trillion. The economy was shut down. Revenues were actually less than we thought. And so we had a deficit in 2020, the actual of $3.3 trillion, a tremendous amount. Again, we've been running about $1 trillion deficit each year. Now we have a deficit of $3.3 trillion. And there's an explanation for this. We had the coronavirus pandemic, extraordinary times. And so as we went into 2021, we went through the budget process again for the following year, and we see we're planning on another, going back to normal, if you might call that normal, another $1 trillion deficit, spending $4.8 trillion, bringing in $3.8 trillion. And what happened? Well, 2021 turned out to be another year where the pandemic didn't go away. We still had a lot of the economy was not open for most of the year, and then opened, and so the House approved another coronavirus relief package. This time it was almost $2 trillion, and so you can see again what happens here. We spent a lot more than we had in previous years. Now we're spending $6.8 trillion and running a deficit of $2.77 trillion. So we went from a situation where we had $1 trillion deficits each year to now we're up in the $3 or close to $3 trillion deficits each year. And so here we have the 2022 pro forma budget. This is from October 2021, and you can see that we're planning on spending $6 trillion. This is kind of the new baseline. Maybe this is just for the period of the time when the pandemic's going on, when the coronavirus is around. These types of pandemics take a few years to work their way through the community, but we're now in this situation where even on a pro forma basis, we're now projecting $2 trillion of a deficit and spending of $6 trillion. So this is kind of where the budget stands right now. We can look and see this has been going on for some time, but it's in the history of the country, it's somewhat of a relatively new phenomenon. So if we go back to the beginning, we really can't. The red and the blue line are really the same. We can see the red line being slightly larger than the blue line, in the period of World War II, and then beginning in the 1970s, it just starts two things you'll notice. One is the curve, instead of being flat, starts to ramp up dramatically. And then also the red line, the expenditures are more than the blue line for most of that time, almost each and every year. And so we've got these, since the 1970s, we've been in this kind of situation where we have deficits every year. And when we get into the 2000s, the deficits become big, real big. If we look at this on another chart, we can kind of see that for most of the time, when we had wars, we had a little bit of a deficit, but it was temporary. And then we get into the 70s and we start to have these deficits. And there's some reasons why this happened. One of the reasons is because in the 1970s, we switched from a gold-backed commodity, a gold-backed money rather, a commodity currency, to a fiat currency, and this allowed, this removed some of the restrictions in terms of spending, which we'll talk more about when we talk about money and banking and monetary history. But you can see here that we have some deficits. They're kind of chronic, but they're smaller compared to what happened in the 2000s when they got really big, and now these here they're in 2020 and 2021 they're kind of off the chart. So what do we see here? We see just in the last number of years, the last few decades, just the chronic deficits, which are getting bigger and bigger, and we can see what that does to the debt, which is all the deficits that are accumulated over time, over these decades. In 1990, we had a $3.2 trillion debt. That was all the debt that was accumulated over all the years. And then just each decade it got bigger, and then the number kind of explodes here between 2010 and 2020. And now it's over $30 trillion, the amount of debt we have in the economy. Now remember, the entire economy produces somewhere in the range of $20 trillion of real GDP. So in each and every year. So $30 trillion is 1.5 years of production. That's how big the debt is. And again, you can see on this chart, just another way of looking at kind of the same story. Debt that starts out small and then just explodes. And explodes off when you get to 2022, it explodes off the chart. And so this is where we are. We've been spending at a federal budget level. We've been spending more than we are bringing in. We're running larger and larger deficits, which contributes to larger and larger debt, and the debt now stands about $30 trillion. Now, it's easy to think about trillions and kind of get lost, millions, billions, trillions. But if this graph here, I think, it gives a good idea of how big a trillion is. If we took $100 bills and we stacked them on top of each other, well, $1 million in $100 bills would reach the top of a chair height. $1 billion in $100 bills would reach the top of the tallest building in the world. And $1 trillion would, and remember, these are $100 bills stacked on top of each other, would reach all the way out into space, well past the International Space Station. And this is $1 trillion. This is, we don't have $30 trillion on here, but this is $1 trillion goes way out into space. You can imagine how far into space $30 trillion goes. So the point here is that we throw these numbers around, $1 trillion deficit or $30 trillion in debt, and these are actually figures with a very, very large magnitude. Now, we're borrowing all this money. Who are we borrowing it from? Well, sometimes it's coming from other countries who are lending us money in return for interest. And when countries do that, the debt that the United States issues is in what's called treasury bills or treasury securities, and they're kind of sold on markets, and it's a way of loaning the government money, the United States government money, and you get paid interest in return. So we can see here that some of the largest owners of our debt is the countries of Japan, China, United Kingdom, Ireland, Luxembourg. And you can also see that Japan has about $1.2 trillion in our debt. China has about a little over a trillion. United Kingdom, half a trillion. It goes down pretty fast. And so that's some of where the debt is, but where's the rest of the debt? Who has it? Well, it turns out that two of the three largest holders of debt are the federal government themselves, or said another way, a different part of the federal government. So the Treasury's borrowing money. Yes, they're borrowing about $7 trillion from other countries in total, but they're borrowing money from the Federal Reserve Bank, from surpluses that are occurring in other parts of the government, like the Social Security and the military retirement funds. And so you can see that almost half of it is coming from other parts of the United States government. And you don't have to be a certified public accountant to know that that's kind of a high risk situation. Um, that's not the best. So um, one way to look at this is that the government needs to borrow more money than people are willing to lend. So we're having to kind of use paper mechanisms or some sort of accounting mechanisms um, to borrow all the money that the Treasury Department needs to borrow. And so, yes, some foreign governments are borrowing, or lending rather, to the federal government. But the biggest line share, almost half now, is coming from other parts of the United States government. And this is a high risk situation. This is not sustainable in the long run, and not really a good thing. Now, another problem with the debt being as high as it is it creates this generational imbalance, meaning the people who are benefiting from the borrowing, from the spending, from the deficit and the debt are the current generation, the old, mostly what we might consider older folks, and they're not really going to be the ones who pay it back because it's going to be paid back in the future. So people's children and grandchildren are ultimately going to have to deal with this problem and either pay it back or find some other way to deal with this tremendous national debt that's been accumulated. Now, it's also interesting to note that $30 trillion is the amount that we've accumulated in borrowing and in debt up to now. But there's a lot of spending that's mandated out into the future. And so if we kind of run the numbers out into the future, the actual debt, the actual net present value of the amount of money we're going to be spending versus the amount of money we're going to bring in is probably a lot larger than $30 trillion. Many estimates put it at $100 trillion or more. So if you were concerned about 30 trillion, you have more reasons to be concerned. And again, the point here is just we're trying to understand fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is using government spending to achieve macroeconomic objectives. Well, we've been doing a whole lot of spending. So some of that's, again, it's not only to achieve macroeconomic objectives, it's also to finance the activities of the government. But we've been spending a lot of money. We've been running up a lot of debt. So it becomes problematic from a standpoint of if we need to spend more. This is partially what happened during the coronavirus pandemic. We needed to spend more money because it was a crisis, and we already had spent a lot of money. We already had deficits. We already had debt. And so this just adds more and more risk into the system. This is a problem that, going forward in the future is going to have to be resolved somehow. Now, it's not only the federal government that spends money, although the federal government spends, as you can see, a lot of money. State and local governments spend an additional $3 trillion. So if the federal government's spending 4.5 or 5.5 or $6 trillion, state and local governments are spending an additional $3 trillion. Now, it turns out that a lot of the government that we are familiar with, that we might touch on a daily basis, like schools and roads and healthcare, that happens at a state and local level. States spend about 1.4 trillion, local governments about 1.6 trillion. It adds to about $3 trillion. And the one big difference is that states and local governments can't really run these long-term debts like the federal government can. The federal government can do it because The federal government also has control over the money supply and can expand the money supply as a way of doing it. Many of the constitutions at a state and local level don't allow it to run deficits on the long term. So we see an additional $3 trillion of spending, but we generally don't see the levels of debt and deficits at a state and local level. So one of the interesting things to look and see in our economy is how much of the money is spent in the private sector and how much money is spent in the public sector. And if you just take the amount of money being spent by the state and local governments and the federal governments, you add it up and divide it by the GDP, we're spending about 40% of our monies in the public sector, and about 60% of our monies are being spent in the private sector. And this, the amount being spent in the public sector has been increasing over time. This, the public sector piece, the red pie piece, has been getting larger on a percentage basis relative to the private sector piece. And this brings up, kind of the big question: is the national debt a problem? There are some folks who figure, well, since we owe it to ourselves, or we borrowed the money, we can always print money. There's an argument that says this is not really a problem because we have ways in the future of just either eliminating it or printing more money or using accounting mechanisms or something else. But I think I think that's not really looking at it in a serious way, not really looking at it in a thorough or academic way. Another way to see this is the national debt is expected to approach $89 trillion by 2029. So this thing is exploding. We saw that in some of the graphs with the red lines that are, kind of jumping off the charts. We also know that the past debt is only a small part of we can project out into the future, and we know how much money is going to be spent, how much is mandatory, how much should be coming in. And so in a very short period of time, we could be tripling this already big number. So the point here is that the problem is only getting worse, not better. And this situation, having these large deficits, having this large debt, it creates a large amount of risk for the financial system overall. This is why people say, well, that's a big deal because we owe it to ourselves. It's creating a lot of financial risk in the system. And, the government has these huge amount of debt. When interest rates are low, they're paying a large amount in interest, but not as much as they would be if interest rates are higher. Now we have a situation where interest rates are starting to get higher because we're experiencing some inflation. So this will put just even more pressure. And so all these pieces here are put together in a very intricate way. And as we saw with the 2008-2009 financial crisis, it doesn't take a lot to set off a financial crisis, to set off a worldwide financial crisis, to set off some sort of a catastrophe. So when we have a situation like this, where we have this huge debt, it's expanding at a rapid rate, it's kind of no solution on the horizon, it creates a lot of financial risk in the system, and it's not just contained to the federal government. It affects really every part of the economy. And then lastly, when we look at, when you have big debt, even with low interest rates, you'll be making bigger and bigger payments. When interest rates go up a little bit, that creates even more pressure on the amount of payments that you have to make. So we're going to spend, within a short period of time, we'll be spending more on interest, servicing the debt from previous spending that we did, than we will spend on research and development, on infrastructure and education combined. So you can see that's not a good situation. We don't want our current budget being spent to pay for past spending. And especially if when the debt is large, the interest payments are large, and just crowds out any current or future spending that we want to do, either to achieve the goals of the government in terms of social programs or the military, or to achieve macroeconomic objectives, which is one of the things that we want to do with the federal budget. So this is the, uh, the purpose of this lecture was to give you an idea about what the budget is, what some of the components are, and how the budget process works, and kind of where we've been over the last few decades with regards to spending, and taxes and things like that. And so, again, the idea here was to give you an idea of how the budget process works. And in our next video, we'll look at using the federal budget to achieve macroeconomic objectives.